Hello and welcome back to another GCSE revision video. Now, I want to go over how to write the perfect GCSE essay on the theme of poverty, which is one of the central themes in A Christmas Carol. Remember that Dickens wrote this novel as a scathing attack on rich, wealthy Victorian businessmen, the Victorian upper classes who ignored the suffering poor and also indirectly led to this problem of poverty in Victorian society by underpaying their workers. The theme of poverty was a central theme within this novella that Dickens wanted his very wealthy readers to not only read but reflect on their own actions and consider how they can change, much like Scrooge changes by stage 5 and becomes a generous benefactor to Tiny Tim. Okay, so if you get this question, let's say it comes up in your GCSE mocks or ultimately in your GCSE final exam, what should you write about? I'm going to show you the top 3 grade 9 points that you want to talk about in any GCSE essay for A Christmas Carol on the theme of poverty. Number 1, when it comes to this theme, you want to always start by discussing how society at large, and more specifically the government, punished the poor for their poverty. Not only did the government punish the poor by passing laws like the New Poor Law, which actually said that if a poor person is unable to find a job and they are homeless, they either have 2 options. Number 1, they can go to work for free in a workhouse and get accommodation in that workhouse, which was usually the cold factory floor. Or option number 2, if they didn't want to go for that option and give away free labor, they were thrown into prison. And of course, Dickens was really critical of this, but equally, he was critical of how the rich neglected the suffering of the poor. And of course, the government helped them to do so and even take further advantage of the poor. And obviously, Scrooge is used as a symbol, as a microcosm of the wealthy who neglected the poor. And this is demonstrated when the charity men come to him, ask him for help, ask him for aid during Christmas time, and he refuses. He supports and demonstrates his support for the New Poor Law and rejects any charity and help by asking these 2 rhetorical questions. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Remember that when it comes to this theme, Dickens was trying to use Scrooge's character to highlight how society at large punished the poor and only made the vicious cycle of poverty worse through passing these harsh laws which punished the poor and made them only poorer. Okay, that's your first winning point. Now your second point to do with the theme of poverty is to do with the Cratchets. Okay, so of course the Cratchets, while Scrooge is a small representation or a small version and symbol of the wider society, the wider rich society in Victorian England. Of course, the Cratchits as well, they are a smaller symbol or a microcosm of poor people in Victorian society. They are symbols of the poor in society. And Dickens specifically uses them to show how the poor were part of the deserving masses of people that deserved charity, that deserved aid. When I say deserving in this way, using inverted commas, what I mean by that is there was a prevalent belief at the time that the poor were seen as, by the rich, as undeserving. They were labeled the undeserving poor. What this means is a lot of rich people at the time believed that the poor had somehow done something immoral that put them in that position of poverty, and they were somehow morally corrupt. That's why they were poor. And Dickens wanted to contradict this, to highlight that actually a lot of poor people at the time were honest, hardworking people. It's just the bosses didn't pay them very well. They were honest people, they were dignified, they were morally upright, and they were actually deserving of help and aid. And he does this through the characters of the Cratchit because he wants to highlight that this belief that the poor were undeserving and somehow immoral was actually wrong. And he uses the Cratchit to show the Cratchit family, and especially the family meal, to show how the poor were not only moral, they were hardworking and actually very grateful for the little they had. And a quotation that shows this is, of course, where they are sitting around a small pudding for a large family. But also another quotation that highlights this is, we are told that they were happy, grateful, and pleased. And by the way, if you're looking at this and you're like, okay, this is helpful, but I want to see how this looks like in a GCSE essay, I'm going to be running a one-off Christmas Carol GCSE masterclass during October half-term week. This is on the 29th of October. In fact, it's the 28th of October. And I'm going to be running a one-off Christmas Carol masterclass on that Tuesday during half-term week, where I'm going to go over not only how to write a grade 9 model answer, but in that live lesson, you can ask me as many questions as you want. And I've also created a 3-page cheat sheet with all the quotes that you need to know for all the main characters, themes, and context. So of course, if you want to know how to do really well, not only in your Christmas Carol mocks, but ultimately in your final GCSE exams, you are more than welcome to join in. Now, the third and final point to do with any question on poverty is, of course, you want to talk about ignorance and want and how they demonstrate society's moral corruption. In other words, what Dickens wants to do when presenting these two characters who Scrooge is like, oh, they're so scary, they look so horrific. He wants to highlight how children are actually the most affected and the worst victims of poverty. Firstly, they don't choose those circumstances, but number two, they are the indirect victims of it. So for example, he uses Bob Cratchit, then we finally see Tim, who's disabled, and we can see this chain of effect, right? So Scrooge not paying Bob Cratchit means that his kids not only grow up poor, but actually if he has disabled children like Tiny Tim, they end up dying an early premature death. These children, ignorance and want, are actually indirectly created by wealthy, greedy businessmen like Scrooge, who refuse to pay their parents and their workers an equal and fair wage. And specifically, obviously, what you want to talk about, especially in connection to how ignorance and want show society's moral corruption, is you obviously want to tie this to how the rich indirectly created these horrific and neglected children. And what's really interesting in the quotation that you want to talk about is when the ghost says, "This boy's ignorance, this girl's want." The ghost also mentions, "Beware them both," because he does this to highlight that these children, who obviously are victims of poverty, their parents can't afford to send them to school, so they become uneducated. Their parents can't even afford to give them basic necessities. These kids eventually become adults who have very few opportunities and thus have to turn to crime, and they end up stealing and being menaces to the wealthy people like Scrooge. So wealthy people, through their greed, actually indirectly end up creating the very threats that they are trying to hide away from, right? So in underpaying the parents of ignorance and want, actually they then end up creating these future criminals who become menaces to them. And this is for the rich readers that Dickens was trying to convey this message to, okay? So that's really it when it comes to how to write the perfect GCSE essay on the theme of poverty in A Christmas Carol. And of course, as I said, if you have any further questions, or if you want to know how to write, really powerful, heavy hitting essays and have grade 9 GCSE model answer to not only use for your mocks, but also for your upcoming final Christmas Carol exams, ultimately in the summertime, then of course you're more than welcome to join in my upcoming half-term GCSE class on the 28th of October. Thanks so much for listening.